Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing very, very well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And I just hope that you've had a fabulous day. Don't forget to get that lovely cup of hot coffee, or whether it's something cool and refreshing that you enjoy. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, their divorce was looming like a dark storm brewing over the horizon. The thunderclouds of their rocky, tumultuous relationship had finally gathered together. They were getting heavier and heavier and heavier, until finally they burst open. The rain pelted down, splashing against the windows with hundreds of tears that dribbled down the glass. They were the tears of what could have been. The endless possibilities, the hopes and the dreams of a future that ultimately would never be fulfilled. There came a point in a marital relationship when finally both parties had to call it quits. That was the case between both my parents, as these days there was no love lost between them. It tore me and my sister apart to hear the two people we loved most in the entire world pulling each other's hair out like this. They didn't realise how much easier it would have been for us if they'd split up a long time ago. They falsely assumed that staying with us is exactly what we wanted. My brother and I would pray that they would leave each other. We longed for peace and quiet in our lives more than anything else in the entire world. We wanted to have the quintessential happy, predictable life, doing routine, standard, customary things in a convivial atmosphere, like most normal families did. How we wanted to be ordinary, for we would have happily settled for boring, tediously dull days doing mundane things. That would have been like sweet music to our ears, for predictable and calm, our lives were certainly not. You could liken our home to a fragile, unstable boat sailing on a stormy sea, being thrust, blasted around violently by gale-force, blustering winds, blowing across the ocean to the left, to the right, made worse by the undercurrent of the choppy, tumultuous high waves, crashing, pounding, battering, and knocking against its hull. That boat is going to be in pretty poor shape after so much upheaval, which was much like the dysfunctional state of our family. It was beginning to crack and fall apart. One morning it happened. I knew it would at some stage, but today was the day. I woke up to find the house unusually quiet. I could hardly believe it. I could not hear the usual sounds of my truculent, sulky mother crashing around in the kitchen, deliberately thrashing pans and crockery around in the sink in one of her pugnacious, contentious temper tantrums. Nor could I hear my father's raised voice telling my mother to shut the F up. On the contrary, the silence was golden. I felt as if I could breathe again, drink in the sweet oxygen of a perfectly beautiful day. I cautiously climbed down the sweeping, ornate mahogany staircase of our very gloomy, depressing Victorian-style home that I'd never ever liked. It was such a dark, oppressive house with a heavy, irksome, pessimistic energy. It blocked out the light of the day, as the sunlight somehow failed to envelop the house, even when the windows were left wide open, when curtains were pinned against the wall. I never could understand why that light failed to filter through our home. It was wallpapered in a hideously ugly gold design against a dark burgundy background. If my mother could go back in time, she would live in the Victorian era, in a heartbeat, provided of course she was part of the gentry and could be waited on by butlers and wear some of those fabulously flamboyant outfits. I found my mother in the kitchen, seated at the dark mahogany kitchen table, her jaundiced face almost as stormy as the wood itself. Her bloodshot eyes were framed by pink rims. She was sniffing into her tissue, her pretty blue eyes clouded by tears. I noticed her slender fingers were trembling as she tried to smoke a cigarette. I'd never seen my mother smoking before. She drew in the smoke, blowing it out of her pursed lips slowly, as if the release of the wispy trail of smoke brought her a measure of comfort. In truth, I'm not even sure she inhaled, but the action of smoking calmed her nerves. "Your father, he's left us for good," she said, sniffing. We're getting a divorce." I could feel the relief welling up in my heart. Silently, inwardly, I was praising God. Peace! Peace at last, I thought. Outwardly, I tried to be rather reassuring. It's probably a good thing, Mum, I said. It's been a long time coming. You and Dad have been at each other's throats for ages. You haven't said a kind word to each other. My mother turned around to look at me. Her eyes seemed almost glazed like a glass marble. She seemed reflective, wistful, speculative. He nearly killed me last night. Well, not really, but he did put his hands around my neck. He began to squeeze, but just for a second. It was only a little squeeze, as if there was a large part of him that really wanted to kill me. I've never seen him so mad. I could see the rage in his eyes. I put a comforting hand on my mother's arm to hearten her. You know Dad isn't a violent man by nature. You know that. I know he'd never harm you. But you have been rubbing him up the wrong way recently. I just think the two of you are not meant to be together. The fact that you even suggest he put his hands around your neck proves your relationship is at that point, breaking point. It proves you're not good together anymore. But I don't understand. What happened? We used to love each other once. We couldn't get enough of each other. How? How did it come to this? I know you're right. He would never hurt me. I know your father. But the fact that he was tempted to wring my neck shows how bad things have gotten between us, and that really disturbs me. Well, maybe it just fizzled out. Maybe your relationship has worn its course. It happens. Life happens. Things only went pear-shaped after we bought this house. Don't you remember? Your father never liked this house. He thought it was gloomy, Platonian, depressing. I remember him saying that the house felt hostile towards him, almost as if it personally wanted to throw him to the curb. The house, I mean, not me. Well, it is gloomy, dim, sombre, and very bleak. I agree with him. I've never ever liked this house. I know you do. But sometimes it feels like it's watching you. You don't think this house has been the cause of our marital problems? My mother asked me suddenly. It wouldn't be the first time this has happened, nor the last. I've been doing some research on supernatural forces that drive people apart, like bad spirits. Maybe that's our problem. Remember when you told us you saw that strange Victorian woman in this house? Your father saw her too. Do you still see her? She asked me. I shuddered. I didn't want to remember the evil old hag that I saw sometimes in our home. I could remember the first time I'd seen her. It was shortly after we moved in to the Victorian house, the house that I simply hated to call home, as everything about this place made my skin crawl. Now that I came to think of it, I do not recall a time when anybody ever laughed or smiled in our home. Every guest who's ever visited us in this place would be so eager to leave soon after they'd shortly arrived, making up a fictitious excuse to go, most especially male visitors who always seemed rather alarmed, as if some unseen invisible force had somehow managed to threaten them. They often complained that they were experiencing a thumping headache, but the moment they left our house, it had miraculously gone. Of course, my mother, who was a skeptic at the best of times, thought it was just a storm in a teacup. I knew it wasn't. Why did my father always suffer from those anomalous headaches at home? But when he left the house, they would magically disappear. That just never made sense to me. My father had tirelessly told my mother over and over again that there was something wrong with the house, but she had refused to listen. "Don't be ridiculous," she would say. My father told her about the witch I'd been seeing in my bedroom at night, which he even had initially perceived as just a nightmare. But then he'd seen her too. He had felt her icy cold hands on his back, pushing him forcefully down the staircase. He had looked up to see who had pushed him. He had witnessed the acrimonious, mean-spirited Victorian woman that I had been seeing. She was glaring at him through a pair of hideously evil eyes. My father said he could feel her thunderous hatred towards him as physically as a blow to the head. It was a tangible experience. He could never forget the creepy, vindictive, triumphant expression upon her face. It seemed she delighted in his anguish, took pleasure in his pain, was desirous for him to suffer, really suffer. She did not want my father in her house, any more than she wanted me hanging around. That was why she had materialized before us. She wanted us to see her. She wanted to drive us away using fear as her weapon. She wanted to terrorize us. It seemed she had laid claim to this space from beyond the grave. "She wants me out of this house," he had told my mother. She is the cause of all the angst and conflict in our home. She does not like me. She doesn't like men at all. Have you not noticed how male visitors never stay at our home? Come on, Sonia, get real. You know we never used to fight like this. We never used to be at each other's throats all the time. Let's sell up, move away, have a brand new start. You know it makes sense." Had my mother listened? Not a chance. She had said, "Oh, don't be so ridiculous. There is no such thing as ghosts." She would become belligerent, unreasonable, cantankerous. Sometimes I would swear that the smile on her face was not even her own. I would wonder if the vindictive ghost in our house was influencing my mother in some way, possibly even speaking through her. For indeed there were times that I questioned whether I was actually speaking to my mother. I remember the first time I ever saw the evil hag. That was when I was lying in bed at night. I was about 13 years old at the time. I could hear the howling, blustering wind outside, rattling the half-open window of my bedroom. It was making a ghastly racket as its wooden pane was slamming, crashing violently against the outside wall. While icy cold air blasted through the room, its feisty currents undulating the curtains that were swinging backwards and forwards. I yawned, groaning as I climbed out of bed surreptitiously, walking over to the window to shut it tightly behind me. It was so freezing in my bedroom. The temperature had dropped substantially. I could see the misty vapour of my own breath before my face. This was not normal for early autumn. I hurriedly bolted towards the window, now waking up quite quickly. I fastened it tightly behind me. Then I glanced out of the window fleetingly. The dark, sultry silhouettes of the large oak trees that fringed our street caught my attention. They jiggled while falling leaves rustled, blowing across the ground like celestial butterflies. But even so, there was no subtle illumination to this night, as menacing shadows seemed to move between the trees. A heavy darkness clung to everything. You could feel it, but not fathom it at all. It seemed so incongruous to the gentle, pleasing ambience of the street I knew. That was when my eyes became fixed on what I can only describe as a rather formidable, solid black silhouette. It stood out like a sore thumb in the duskiness as a focal point. It was much, much blacker, denser and darker than anything else. I leaned against the window, my nose smudged against the glass. I tried to discern what this solid vertical mass actually was. Then it began to move. I realized it was the shape of a woman. She was blacker than the night, wearing a full Victorian dress. In a trice, the hard, angular face with the sharp features was drawn towards my window. Slowly and surely, her chin lifted upwards, her dark, soulless eyes pinning on me. They glared at me. In terror, I swiftly ran to my bed, dived under the covers to hide from what I'd seen. My heart pounding violently in my chest, my breathing laboured, my body trembling in terror. All of a sudden, the tightly fastened window blew open on its own accord. Now I ask you, how does that happen? I had secured the window extra tight. I could hear the wooden pane banging loudly against the outside wall. Now I was scared, really, really scared. A rush of icy wind blew through my bedroom, its howl now reduced to a baleful, moaning sound, while the curtains swung backwards and forwards, making that portentous, inauspicious clicking sound with a loud, continuous tap, 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 while the railing rattled. But something else threatening had entered the room. Not just the wind, something else. I could feel a very substantial presence. Dare I look, I thought. I knew in the gut of my being that something was there. I was so afraid of what I would see. Someone was in my room. I could hear the bustle of a fabric skirt caressing the floor. Not that hideous old bat, I thought. Please, God, no! Don't let it be her! I peeked over the covers. Then I saw her. The haunting, apocalyptic woman that I'd seen outside my window was now standing at the end of my bed, leering at me, with a menacious, ill-omened grin developing on her face that rather reminded me of a menacing clown. I could see her clearly now. Her skin was whiter than paper, her eyes dark, hostile, uncongenial. Her promenade dress tapered at the waist, spread out into a full bustle skirt. She moved towards me, getting closer, closer, and closer with every step. I screamed and screamed. Seconds later, she was just gone. My father came bolting into my bedroom. "What is it, son?" he asked. There was an evil woman in my room," I cried. "She was staring at me. She was hideously evil." "Now, son, there is no one here," my father reassured me. "You were just having a nightmare." He walked over to the window to fasten it behind him. "You shouldn't leave your window open like this, with a gusty wind blowing out there." Since that day I had seen her occasionally in our house, always with that malevolent, victorious grin on her face, as if she was triumphant about something. Sometimes when I was getting dressed for school, a dark shadow would quickly dart past me in the mirror. I would also sometimes feel eyes searing through me when I opened my closet door. Sometimes something would brush against my shoulders with a light touch that felt more like a push or a shove. Other times I'd hear the bustle of her skirt, or a faint bouquet of her flowery fragrance. "Son," my mother repeated, "can you hear me? Are you listening? Do you still see her in this house?" she demanded. "Please, I need to know." "Yes, I do from time to time," I admitted. "I don't always physically see her, but I can sense her, hear her, and even smell her." "But why do you care now? When Dad was here, he told you that the house was problematic, that there was a ghostly woman that could potentially be the instigator of your marital problems. But you refused to listen. Isn't it a bit late in the day to be crying over spilt milk? I mean, the horse has already bolted. There's no need to be so nasty." "Oh, it is this bloody house. I knew it," said my mother. "Your father and I, we never used to fight like this." Fast forward to about 3 months after my father had left home. My mother told us we were going to stay with him for a while. We were to learn he was living in a trailer home in a farmer's field. He was doing odd jobs for the man in exchange for board, as well as jobs for other locals in the rural town. We were to learn that he was living in a trailer indefinitely, until he decided where it was he wanted to lay down roots. Me and my sister Jolene were aching to see my father again. We had missed him so terribly much. We were eager to see him. Once a taxi dropped us outside the trailer, we were at last reunited with him. I could see he looked absolutely exhausted, as if the past 2 years of constant bickering with my mother had worn him to a frazzle. I told my father that Mum was now considering that the Victorian house was to blame for their breakup. He looked at me in surprise. "I have been telling her that for 2 whole years, but would she listen? Not a chance. She was insistent I was wrong. You know she was the one that wanted that horrid house. None of us did. What she saw in it is beyond me. Even the day we looked around the place, it haunted me." "I've never liked the house, Dad," I agreed. "Do you miss Mum?" I asked. "I don't miss the way we were in that house, son, but I missed what we were before we moved into that god-awful place. I miss all our family being together, like the good old days." My father's trailer was pretty standard, nothing special really, very mediocre, but the breathtaking countryside that surrounded it really was spectacular. It more than made up for its inadequacies. There were acres of dense woodland, flowering meadows, and undulating green fields. It felt like we were on a fabulous holiday, even though we were living far removed from the lap of luxury. A Spartan, rather simple existence with solar energy and propane gas heaters, but we didn't care. It was great to be reunited with our dad again. That's what really counted. "You can explore anywhere you like, but the farmer has told me the woods behind the trailer you would do best to avoid." "Why?" we asked. "Not sure, really. He seemed adamant that it was out of bounds somehow." I must confess that the most reckless thing my father could have done was to tell us that the woods behind us were not to be explored. It's a little like putting a juicy bone next to a naughty dog, telling him not to eat it. It's never going to work. The temptation becomes irresistible. I've always appreciated beauty in every form, but this woodgrove was out of this world. The trees were so tall, majestic, imposing, statuesque, sweeping up into the sky like graceful giants. Their full branches spread out like ballet dancers, while light twinkled through the leaves, dancing onto the forest floor, bespeckling and dappling it in an ethereal light. We were aware of the pretty sounds of the birds tweeting, accompanied by the soothing sound of a waterfall, crashing, thundering, cascading, foaming, and fizzing over the rocks, where it fell downwards into pretty pools of water below. "Oh, it's so beautiful in here," said my sister, dashing eagerly towards the rock pool, with a reverent enthusiasm. "No wonder the farmer doesn't want anyone around here. This place is the quintessential day spa. Have you ever seen anything so lovely?" We both eagerly threw off our socks and shoes and went paddling in the water. It was deliciously cool. The exuberant spray from the waterfall created a feisty current, which was very invigorating as it jetted against our legs, while its misty spray splashed our faces with droplets of water. We were in heaven. Then we stopped dead in our tracks, for we could see a large black bear sitting in the water, its powerful back facing away from us. He possibly hadn't heard us, as the fast pace of the waterfall drowned out all the noise. Such a sight made the hackles on the back of my neck stand on edge, as I knew that you never wanted to surprise a black bear, as it could potentially become quite aggressive. An angry bear is a dangerous creature indeed, with a capacity to kill if it feels threatened. My sister was pointing to the bear, trying to use sign language to get us to leave the water immediately, but it was too late. The creature had seen us. I could see its head swivelling around to look directly at us. But this was not a bear. What was it? The creature looked as if it was part ape and part human. I was so stunned by what I was observing that my jaw dropped open in astonishment, my eyes growing as round as saucers, my body trembling in dismay. Whatever this creature was, it was far more intimidating than a bear. The next thing I knew was that the creature rose up on its back haunches, in the water. He stood up, shaking the excess water out of his hair, rather like a shaggy dog. He towered at about 8 foot tall, was all hair, solid brawn, powerful muscle. When it stood up on its 2 legs, it positively made a black bear look like a kid's fluffy toy. The eyes on this creature terrified the living daylights out of me. I could see the anger, indignation, and aggression igniting in those deep-set eyes. The creature began to snarl at us. It then ground its teeth together, pulling back its lips to reveal its oversized human teeth. Then it unleashed the most terrifying growl that caused the forest to shudder, let alone me. I was standing there in the water. My sister was screaming my name, but I failed to hear her, as her voice seemed like a faint murmur in the distance, like a radio from miles away. My eyes were drawn deeper and deeper into his gaze, like a magnetic hold that locked me in his stare, that I could not release myself from, almost as if I'd been handcuffed to a chair. I tried to look away from his gaze, but I couldn't break the spell that was holding me prisoner. Jolene bravely lunged towards me. She grabbed my hands violently, pulling me as hard as she could away from the water. "What the heck is wrong with you?" she spouted. "For goodness sake, run!" I was suddenly shaken out of that hypnotic stupor. I began to run. My sister was hot on my trail. I felt like a deer being pursued by a savage lion. I know exactly what it feels like to be hunted, to be at the mercy of another wild animal that actually has no mercy. I felt powerless against this mighty beast. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, the fast pace of my breathing, along with the desperate voice in my head that kept telling me to run for my life. Every time the creature's padded foot hit the ground, it was like it thundered. Boom, 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 as the feet got ever closer towards me. I was sure that in any second it would grab me. Tears began to stream down my cheeks, but finally hope gleamed on the horizon like a colourful rainbow, offering some promise. My sister and I exited the forest. We went running through the open meadow towards the trailer. We dashed inside the trailer, slamming the door behind us as fast and as quickly as we could. But the creature never followed us. We glanced out of the trailer window, looking towards the forest. We could see him retreating back into the woods from whence he came. We never told my father what we'd seen, but we declined any opportunity to go into those woods again. We were to find out later that we had encountered a Bigfoot. One day my father announced that he was seeing a very special lady who was to become our new stepmother. We were going to meet her at a restaurant in Charleston the following day. "I want you to be very nice to her," he told us. "Be on your best behaviour." "But Dad, you've only recently ended it with Mum. Isn't it too soon to go gallivanting into another relationship?" I said. "It's never too soon to have a fresh start," said my father, giving me a grin. "Don't you worry. I'm sure you're going to like her." I felt very resentful that my father was seeing someone new. How could he? It was hard to digest this appalling revelation. It was like ingesting something seriously sour, unpalatable, repugnant. I felt like I was going to be violently sick, hurl all over the place. Now it all made sense to me. Over the last 3 weeks, while we had stayed in his trailer home, my father had been behaving rather strangely. He'd been humming to himself in the morning when he was shaving, singing to himself in the shower, disappearing furtively behind the trailer to talk to someone on his cell phone. And furthermore, during the late evenings, he would usually be gone for a couple of hours, always making some kind of lame excuse to us. I had known he'd been up to something, but having an affair while we were staying in his trailer, I mean, how low could he get? It was disgusting. "I'm not going to like her," I told my sister. "I know I'm not." "Well, try to be nice to her," said Jolene. "I mean, you want Daddy to be happy, don't you?" I mumbled. The truth was, despite the chaos and pandemonium in our previous home, I couldn't envisage my father with another woman. The attentive young waitress invited us to sit at a rather grandiose-looking table that we had booked at an ornate-looking stylish restaurant in Charleston, credited with having the most phenomenal chefs. It seemed my father was going overboard to impress this lady of his. Again, I could feel the resentment rising up in the back of my throat. I was far from happy. I knew I was going to be waspish towards her. I wouldn't be able to help myself from sticking the knife in. I already despised her and disliked her. We were seated on the lavish upholstered chairs as the waitress started taking down our drinks orders, when who should walk into the restaurant but my mother. She looked more beautiful and radiant than I'd seen her look in a long time, almost as if she'd dropped 10 years off her age. She looked like a butterfly that had emerged from a cocoon. She seemed younger, more vibrant, incredibly radiant. She ran towards me and my sister, giving us both warm, loving hugs. The next thing I knew, my father was cradling her in his arms. They were kissing each other passionately. I didn't know where to look. It was so embarrassing. My parents were behaving like two lovesick teenagers, with eyes only for each other. "What's going on?" I asked, looking from my mother to my father in bewilderment. I was to learn from my mother that while we'd been staying with my dad at his trailer, she'd put our Victorian home on the market. A psychic had been called around to the property. She could sense the presence of a hostile Victorian governess who used to live at the house back in the day, taking care of a couple of young children who lived there. The ghost communicated with the psychic. She admitted to turning my parents against each other deliberately. She claimed she despised all men. She was determined to get my father out of our house, using drastic measures by turning up the heat between them. She admitted to filling my mother's head with hateful thoughts towards him. I must admit I was sceptical that my parents' relationship could be restored to its former glory. Surely there was too much water under the bridge, I thought, too much damage already done, too many cruel cutting words that had been spoken. It would seem I was wrong, because when our family moved into a brand new home, our lives were transformed, and barely ever did I hear them argue again. They are still very much in love today, and happily married. So there you are. That's my story. What a lovely story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.